They told her she would never see him again. The barbed wire would keep them apart forever. But on a spring morning in 1945, inside an American POW camp in Texas, something impossible happened. A German prisoner stood at a makeshift altar in his camp uniform, waiting for his bride. And the man who gave her away? The same American commander who had captured her fiancé on a battlefield in France. Love, it seemed, had no respect for war. If this story moves you, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe, because history has more incredible tales to share, and you won't want to miss them. Camp Swift, Texas, May 1945. The war in Europe had just ended, but thousands of German soldiers remained behind barbed wire across America, waiting for the long journey home. The Texas heat was already building, even in spring. Dust devils danced across the parade grounds. Wooden barracks stretched in neat rows under the endless sky. Guard towers stood at each corner, their shadows long in the morning sun. This was not a place for romance. This was a place for waiting, for counting days, for wondering if home still existed across an ocean that seemed impossibly wide. Hans Miller had been counting those days for 18 months. He was 24 years old, tall and lean, with the kind of face that still held traces of boyhood despite everything he had seen. He had been captured in France in the autumn of 1944, part of the massive wave of German prisoners flooding into Allied hands as the Wehrmacht collapsed. They had shipped him across the Atlantic, seasick and terrified, to a land he had only heard about in propaganda films. America, they had been told, was a place of gangsters and violence. Instead, he found order, abundance, and something he never expected: a future. The camp smelled of dust, sweat, and the mesquite trees that dotted the Texas landscape. Hans worked in the camp laundry, his hands red from hot water and lye soap. The work was mindless, repetitive, but it kept him busy. It kept him from thinking too much about the village in Bavaria where his mother waited, about the farmhouse that might be rubble now, about the life that might not exist anymore. But then he met her, Greta Schneider. She was not a prisoner. She was not even supposed to be there. She was a German-American girl from San Antonio, 22 years old, visiting the camp with a church group that brought books and music to the prisoners. Her parents had emigrated before the war, but she still spoke German with the accent of her mother's homeland. When Hans first saw her through the wire fence, handing out hymnals for a Sunday service, he thought she looked like light made solid, blonde hair catching the sun, green eyes bright with something he had not seen in years, hope. Their eyes met across the fence. It was nothing really, a glance, a smile, but in a place where every day felt the same, where the future was a gray question mark. That small moment burned bright. Wait, this could not be real? A prisoner and a free woman? The wire separated more than just ground. It separated entire worlds. The church group came every Sunday, and every Sunday Hans found reasons to be near the chapel area. He was not particularly religious, but he discovered a sudden interest in hymns. The other prisoners teased him, but they understood. In the camp, beauty was rare. Kindness was rarer. And Greta was both. For weeks they spoke only across the fence. The rules were strict, no direct contact between prisoners and civilians without supervision. But the guards, mostly young men who themselves had sweethearts back home, were not cruel. They looked the other way when conversation stretched long. They pretended not to notice when Greta's fingers touched the fence near where Hans stood. Greta learned his story in fragments. He had been a mechanic before the war, working in his father's garage in a village near Munich. He had been drafted in 1942, too young to question, too patriotic to resist. He had never wanted to fight. He had fixed trucks and tanks, keeping machinery running in a war that ground men to dust. When the Americans captured his unit near Nancy, France, he had felt not shame but relief. The war was over for him. He had survived. Hans learned her story too. Her parents had left Germany in 1938, seeing the storm clouds gathering. They had built a small bakery in San Antonio, serving the German community that had settled in Texas generations before. Greta had grown up American but had never forgotten her roots. She spoke German at home, ate spätzle and schnitzel, listened to her mother's stories of the old country. When the war came, her family was torn, grateful to be in America, but aching for the homeland they had left behind. "Why do you come here?" Hans asked her one Sunday, his hands gripping the fence. "You could be anywhere. Why come to a prison?" Greta looked at him with those steady green eyes. "Because you are not just prisoners. You are people, and people need to know they are not forgotten." It was the simplest answer, and it changed everything. The commander of Camp Swift was Colonel James McCarthy, a career officer from Boston who had seen combat in North Africa and Italy before being assigned to run the POW facility. He was a practical man, not given to sentimentality, but he was also fair. He believed in the Geneva Convention. He believed prisoners should be treated with dignity. He had no love for the Nazi regime, but he knew that most of the men in his camp were not ideologues. They were just soldiers who had done what their country asked and lost. Colonel McCarthy noticed Hans and Greta. It was hard not to. Every Sunday, the same young man, the same young woman, talking their way through the fence like the wire was not even there. He watched them carefully. He saw no conspiracy, no threat to security. He saw two young people falling in love in the most unlikely place imaginable. One day he called Hans to his office. Hans went with his heart in his throat, certain he was about to be punished, perhaps moved to another camp, separated from Greta forever. He stood at attention in front of the colonel's desk, his hands trembling slightly. "At ease, Muller," the colonel said, leaning back in his chair. He studied Hans for a long moment. "The girl from the church, Greta Schneider. You have feelings for her?" It was not a question. Hans swallowed hard. "Yes, sir." "And she for you?" "I believe so, sir." The colonel was quiet. Then he said something Hans never expected. "You know this war will end. You will go home, and she will stay here. That is the reality. Love is a fine thing, but it does not change facts." Hans felt something crack inside his chest. "I know, sir." "But," the colonel continued, and Hans looked up sharply, "there are ways. The rules are complicated, but they exist. A prisoner can apply for permission to remain in the United States after the war if he has a valid reason. Employment. Family." He paused. "Marriage." The word hung in the air like a miracle. "Marriage, sir?" "There is paperwork. A lot of it, and it will not be easy. The government is not eager to let enemy soldiers stay. But if the woman is American, if she vouches for you, if you can prove you are not a security risk—" The colonel shrugged. "It has been done. Not often. But it has been done." Hans could barely breathe. "You would allow this?" Colonel McCarthy looked at him with something almost like kindness. "I have seen enough hate in this war, son. If there is a chance for something good, I am not going to stand in the way." That night, Hans lay in his bunk, staring at the wooden ceiling of the barracks, his mind racing. The other men snored around him, a symphony of exhaustion. He thought about Greta, about the impossible possibility the colonel had laid before him. Marriage, staying in America, building a life in a country that had been his enemy. It felt like a dream, but it also felt terrifying. To stay would mean never seeing Bavaria again, never walking the streets of his village, never sitting at his mother's table. He would become a man without a country, belonging fully to neither Germany nor America. He would be forever in between, forever marked by his past. But when he thought of Greta, her smile, her voice, the way she looked at him like he was more than a prisoner, more than a defeated enemy, the fear faded. She was a future. She was a reason to hope, and hope was something he had not felt in a very long time. The next Sunday he told her what the colonel had said. They stood at the fence, their fingers almost touching through the wire, and he asked her the question that would change both their lives. "Greta, if there was a way for me to stay in America, if there was a way for us to be together, would you want that?" Greta did not hesitate. Her eyes filled with tears, but her voice was steady. "Yes. Yes, I would want that more than anything." "Even though I am German? Even though I was your enemy?" "You are not my enemy, Hans. You never were. You are just a man who got caught in a terrible war. And I—" She smiled through her tears. "I love you." It was the first time either of them had said it aloud. The words felt huge, impossible, and absolutely true. Emotional peak note. This confession is the first major emotional climax. The narrator should slow down here. Let the moment breathe. The paperwork began immediately. Colonel McCarthy was true to his word. He submitted the necessary forms to the War Department, requesting permission for Hans to remain in the United States after his release. He wrote letters of recommendation, vouching for Hans's character and his work ethic in the camp. He explained that Hans posed no security threat, that he had been a mechanic, not an officer, and that his only crime had been being born German at the wrong time. But the wheels of bureaucracy turned slowly. Weeks passed, then months. The summer heat became unbearable, turning the camp into an oven. The prisoners took refuge in the shade, moving as little as possible. Hans continued his work in the laundry, but now every day felt like waiting. Waiting for approval, waiting for permission to have a future. Greta came every Sunday without fail. Her parents were not thrilled about her attachment to a German POW, but they did not forbid it. They had left Germany for a reason, but they also understood love, and they could see that their daughter had made up her mind. When Greta Schneider decided something, heaven and earth could not change it. The other prisoners watched Hans's courtship with a mixture of envy and hope. If Hans could build a life here, maybe others could too. Maybe America was not just a temporary stop, but a new beginning. Some began to study English more seriously. Others asked about work opportunities, about staying, about the mechanics of building a life in a foreign land. The guards, too, softened. They saw Hans and Greta and remembered their own loves, their own reasons for fighting. War made men hard, but it also reminded them what they were fighting for. The chance to love, to build, to hope for something better. Some guards started looking the other way when Hans and Greta sat on opposite sides of the fence talking for hours. One guard, a young corporal from Oklahoma, even brought them lemonade once, setting the glasses down on each side of the wire without a word. The contradiction gnawed at everyone in the camp. Here were men who had fought each other, killed each other, destroyed each other's cities, and now they were sharing cigarettes, trading jokes, falling in love. It made no sense, and yet it made perfect sense. The war had been about nations, about ideologies, about leaders and borders. But this was about people. And people, when given the chance, almost always chose life over death, love over hate. In September, the telegram arrived. Colonel McCarthy called Hans to his office again, and this time his expression was unreadable. Hans's heart hammered as he stood at attention, certain the answer was no, certain his future had just evaporated. "Sit down, Muller," the colonel said. Hans sat, his legs weak. The colonel pushed a paper across the desk. Hans stared at it, the words blurring. Then slowly they came into focus. Permission granted for Hans Muller, German POW, to remain in the United States under sponsorship of Greta Schneider, pending marriage and verification of employment. Hans looked up, his eyes wide. "It is approved?" "It is approved." Hans felt tears sting his eyes. He tried to speak, but no words came. The colonel, seeing his struggle, allowed himself a small smile. "There are conditions. You will need to find employment within 30 days of your release. You will need to marry Miss Schneider, as stated in the application. You will be monitored for the first year. But yes, Muller, you can stay." "Thank you, sir." "Thank you, Hans could not finish. He simply stood, saluted with shaking hands, and left the office before he embarrassed himself by weeping in front of his commander. He ran to the fence. Greta was not there. It was not Sunday, but he stood there anyway, gripping the wire, staring out at the Texas landscape, and for the first time in years he felt truly free. The wire was still there. He was still a prisoner. But inside something had unlocked. When Sunday came, he told Greta. She screamed, actually screamed, loud enough that the guards turned to look. She pressed her hands to the fence, and Hans pressed his to match them, palm to palm with only the wire between them. "We can get married," she said, her voice shaking with joy. "We can really get married." "Yes, we can really get married." And then Greta said something that made Hans's heart stop. "I want to get married here, in the camp. I want to marry you right now, not in some distant future. I want everyone to see that love is stronger than war." Hans stared at her. "Married in a POW camp? Why not? This is where we met. This is where we fell in love. And this is where we will begin our life together." It was crazy. It was impossible. It was perfect. Colonel McCarthy did not laugh when they made the request. He listened carefully as Hans and Greta explained what they wanted. A wedding inside Camp Swift, with the prisoners as guests, with the guards as witnesses. They wanted to marry before Hans was officially released, while he was still technically a prisoner of war. They wanted to prove that even barbed wire could not keep love away. The colonel leaned back in his chair, considering. It was unorthodox. It might even be against regulations. But then again, this whole situation was unorthodox. A German POW marrying an American girl. A prisoner asking to stay in the country that had defeated him. Nothing about this fit the neat categories of military law. "If I allow this," the colonel said slowly, it will be news. Reporters will come. People will talk. Are you prepared for that?" Hans and Greta looked at each other. Then Greta spoke. "Let them talk. Let them see that something good can come from something terrible. Let them see that people are more than their flags." The colonel smiled. "All right, I will allow it, but I have one condition." "Anything, sir," Hans said. "If this is going to be a proper wedding, someone needs to give away the bride. And since your father is in Germany, Miss Schneider, and since I am the one who made this possible—" He paused, a twinkle in his eye. "I would be honored to walk you down the aisle." Greta's eyes filled with tears. "You would do that?" "I would." And so it was decided. Camp Swift would host a wedding. The preparations began immediately. The prisoners, excited to be part of something joyful, threw themselves into the work. They built an arch out of wood and decorated it with wildflowers gathered from the fields outside the camp. They polished the chapel until it gleamed. They pressed their uniforms and rehearsed a German hymn to sing during the ceremony. The camp chaplain, Father O'Brien, a kind man from Philadelphia, agreed to officiate. He had never married a POW before, but he believed in love, and he believed in redemption. "God works in mysterious ways," he told Hans. "Who am I to stand in his way?" Greta's mother made her a simple dress, white cotton with lace at the collar. It was not grand, but it was beautiful. Greta cried when she tried it on, seeing herself transform from a girl who visited a prison to a bride who would marry inside one. Word spread beyond the camp. Newspapers got wind of the story. German POW to marry American girl in Texas camp, the headlines read. Some people were outraged. How could an enemy soldier be allowed to marry an American? How could this be permitted while the war's wounds were still fresh? But others were moved. They saw in Hans and Greta something hopeful, something that suggested the world might heal after all. The contradictions gnawed at everyone. It was not cruelty that defined this moment, but grace. Memory collided with reality, and reality, for once, was kinder. The night before the wedding, Hans could not sleep. He lay in his bunk, listening to the familiar sounds of the barracks, snoring, coughing, the creak of wood settling in the cool night air. Tomorrow he would marry Greta. Tomorrow he would begin a new life, but tonight he wrestled with ghosts. He thought about his mother in Bavaria. He had written to her, but he did not know if the letters arrived. Germany was chaos now, occupied by foreign armies, its cities destroyed. Was she alive? Was she hungry? Was she ashamed of him for staying in America, for choosing love over loyalty to the homeland? He thought about his comrades, the men he had served with. Some were dead, blown apart in battles that accomplished nothing. Others were in camps like this one, waiting to go home, or perhaps not wanting to go home, not knowing what home even meant anymore. He thought about the boy from Hamburg who had bunked next to him in France, who had talked endlessly about his girlfriend, who had died when a shell hit their position. That boy would never marry. That boy would never have a future. And yet Hans would. He would live, love, build something new. Was that fair? Was he betraying the dead by choosing happiness? Or was he honoring them by refusing to let the war destroy everything? By insisting that life could still be beautiful? He did not know. But he knew he loved Greta, and he knew that love, stubborn and unreasonable, had saved him when nothing else could. In the bunk above him, another prisoner whispered in the dark, "Hans." "Yes?" "Tomorrow, when you marry her, you are doing something for all of us. You are proving that we are not just the enemy. We are people. So do not doubt yourself. You deserve this." Hans felt his throat tighten. "Thank you. Now get some sleep. You do not want to look like death at your own wedding." Laughter rippled through the barracks, soft and warm. And Hans, surrounded by men who had once been strangers, who had become brothers in captivity, finally closed his eyes and slept. The morning of the wedding was clear and bright. The Texas sun rose hot and golden, burning off the last of the night's coolness. The camp buzzed with energy. Prisoners polished their boots, combed their hair, tried to make themselves presentable. This was not just Hans's wedding, it was their wedding too, a shared moment of joy in a place built for confinement. The guards too felt the excitement. They had been told to maintain order, to ensure security, but even they could not help smiling. One guard, Sergeant Miller, a gruff man from Tennessee who rarely spoke, pulled Hans aside before the ceremony. "Listen, son," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I fought in France. I saw what you people did. I lost friends because of your army." He paused, and Hans braced himself for anger, for rejection. But instead, Sergeant Miller stuck out his hand. "But you are not your army, and I am not going to let the past ruin something good. So congratulations." Hans shook his hand, too overwhelmed to speak. It was a small gesture, but it felt enormous. This man who had every reason to hate him was choosing something different. He was choosing to let go. Greta arrived at noon, escorted by her parents. She wore her simple white dress and carried a bouquet of wildflowers, bluebonnets, and Indian paintbrush, the flowers of Texas. She looked nervous and radiant and impossibly beautiful. Her father, a quiet man who had said little about the wedding, placed a hand on her shoulder. "You are sure about this?" he asked in German. Greta looked up at him. "I have never been more sure of anything in my life," he nodded. "Then I am happy for you." Colonel McCarthy met them at the gate, dressed in his formal uniform. He offered Greta his arm, and she took it, tears already shimmering in her eyes. Together they walked into the camp, past rows of prisoners standing at attention, past guards who saluted, past a world that said this should not be possible. The chapel was packed. Prisoners filled the pews, their faces solemn and hopeful. At the front, Father O'Brien waited, his vestments simple but dignified. And at the altar, Hans stood in his camp uniform, gray and plain, the uniform of a defeated enemy, but his face was alive with joy. As Greta walked down the aisle on the arm of the American colonel who had once been her fiancé's captor, every person in that chapel understood they were witnessing something rare. This was not just a marriage. This was a refusal to let hate win. This was two people insisting that love was more powerful than borders, than war, than all the rules that said they should be enemies. Father O'Brien began the ceremony with a prayer. His voice was steady and kind, filling the small chapel with warmth. "We are gathered here today," he said, "not just to witness a marriage, but to witness the triumph of hope over despair, of love over hatred, of the future over the past." He spoke about how war tears the world apart, but how people, ordinary people, have the power to stitch it back together. He spoke about forgiveness, about the courage it takes to love someone from the other side, about how God sees no nations, only souls. Hans and Greta exchanged their vows in both German and English, their voices shaking with emotion. Hans promised to love her, to honor her, to build a life worthy of the second chance he had been given. Greta promised to stand by him, to be his home when his homeland was lost, to love him not despite where he came from, but because of who he was. When it came time to exchange rings, they used simple bands that Greta's father had made in his workshop, silver, unadorned, but inscribed with the date May 12th, 1945. And then Father O'Brien pronounced them husband and wife. Hans kissed Greta, and the chapel erupted in applause. Prisoners cheered in German, guards cheered in English. For a moment there was no difference between them. There was only joy. Afterward there was a small reception in the camp mess hall. The cooks, both American and prisoner, had collaborated to make a feast, or as much of a feast as wartime rations allowed. There was bread, cheese, some canned fruit, and a small cake that Greta's mother had managed to bake. It was not much, but it felt like a banquet. The prisoners sang German songs. The guards taught them American songs. Greta danced with Hans, and then with Colonel McCarthy, and then with any prisoner brave enough to ask. The sun set over Camp Swift, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and for those few hours the war felt very far away. One old prisoner, a man named Friedrich, who had been a teacher before the war, approached Hans and Greta during the reception. He had tears in his eyes. "Thank you," he said quietly. Hans frowned. "For what?" "For reminding us that we are still human. For showing us that there is something to go back to, even if we cannot go back to Germany. You have given us hope." Greta squeezed Hans's hand, her own eyes shining. "We did not do this alone. Everyone here made this possible." Friedrich nodded. "Yes, but you had the courage to believe it could happen. That is more than most of us have." As the reception wound down and the evening deepened into night, Colonel McCarthy stood to speak. The room fell silent. The colonel was not a man given to speeches, but tonight he made an exception. "I have been a soldier for 20 years, he began. "I have seen the best and worst of what men can do to each other. I have seen bravery and cowardice, sacrifice and selfishness. But I have rarely seen what I saw today." He looked at Hans and Greta, standing together at the center of the room. "This war began because men forgot that their enemies were human. It escalated because we stopped seeing each other as fathers, sons, brothers, and saw only uniforms and flags. Millions died because we forgot the simple truth that we are all, at the end of the day, just people trying to live and love and find meaning in a difficult world." The room was absolutely still. Every prisoner, every guard, every person present hung on his words. Today a German soldier and an American girl stood before God and declared that love is stronger than war. They declared that the future does not have to be a repetition of the past. They declared that we have a choice. We can carry hate forward, or we can choose something better. He raised his glass. "To Hans and Greta, may your marriage be long, happy, and proof that even in the darkest times, light can break through." Everyone stood. Glasses were raised, tin cups filled with water, since alcohol was forbidden in the camp, and the toast echoed, "To Hans and Greta." Hans felt something break open inside him, something he had kept locked since the day he was captured. It was not grief, not quite. It was the release of grief, the letting go of a burden he had carried for so long he had forgotten it was there. He was no longer just a prisoner. He was no longer just a defeated enemy. He was a husband. He was a man with a future. Greta leaned against him, her head on his shoulder, and whispered, "We did it. We actually did it." "Yes," Hans whispered back. "We did." Later, when the reception ended and the prisoners returned to their barracks, Hans and Greta were given a small room, a storage area that had been hastily converted into a private space for their wedding night. It was not much, just a cot and a blanket, but it was theirs. For one night, they were not separated by wire. For one night, they were just two people in love. As they lay together in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the camp settling down for the night, Greta asked, "Are you scared?" "Of what?" "Of the future. Of what comes next." Hans thought for a moment. "No, I am not scared. Because whatever comes next, we will face it together." And in that small makeshift room in a prisoner of war camp in Texas, two people who should have been enemies fell asleep as husband and wife, proof that love, when given the chance, will always find a way. Hans was officially released from Camp Swift 3 weeks after the wedding. The process was anticlimactic. Some paperwork, a handshake from Colonel McCarthy, and a walk through the gates that had confined him for nearly 2 years. He wore civilian clothes that Greta had brought, simple trousers and a shirt that felt strange after so long in uniform. He carried a small bag with his few possessions, a Bible, some letters, and the wedding photograph that a guard had taken, showing him and Greta standing under the flower arch with the barbed wire visible in the background. Greta was waiting for him outside the gate, leaning against her father's truck. When she saw him walk out, she ran to him, and he caught her, spinning her around as she laughed and cried at the same time. "You are free," she said, her hands on his face. "You are really free." "We are free," he corrected. They drove to San Antonio to the small apartment above her parents' bakery that would be their first home. It was tiny, one room with a bed, a table, and a window that looked out onto the street, but it was theirs. Hans stood at the window looking down at the city that would now be his city and felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, gratitude, and a deep, aching sadness for everything he had left behind. The first months were hard. Hans worked in the bakery, learning the trade from Greta's father. His German was useful. Many of the customers were immigrants, but his accent marked him. Some people were kind, others were not. More than once he was called a Nazi, spat at, told to go back to Germany. He endured it silently, knowing that anger would solve nothing. Greta defended him fiercely, but it took a toll. She had not anticipated how hard it would be, how much hostility they would face. People who had been her friends suddenly looked at her differently. Some stopped coming to the bakery. Others whispered behind her back, "She married the enemy. How could she?" But slowly things began to change. Hans's work ethic spoke louder than his accent. He was reliable, skilled, and unfailingly polite. He learned English quickly, though he never lost his German cadence. He joined the local church, attended town meetings, became part of the community not by demanding acceptance, but by quietly earning it. And then in the spring of 1946, Greta told him she was pregnant. Hans wept when she gave him the news. A child. A new life. Proof that they were not just surviving, but building something that would outlast the war. Their daughter Anna was born in December 1946. She had her mother's green eyes and her father's serious expression. Hans held her in his arms, this tiny person who was both German and American, both past and future, and he knew that everything, the fear, the pain, the uncertainty, had been worth it. Over the years, Hans and Greta built a life that defied easy categories. They were not fully German, not fully American, but something in between. They spoke German at home and English in public. They celebrated Christmas with both German and American traditions. They taught Anna to be proud of both her heritages, to see herself not as torn between two worlds, but as a bridge connecting them. Hans never returned to Germany. He learned through the Red Cross that his mother had survived the war but had died in 1948. He mourned her deeply, carrying the guilt of not being there for her final years. But he also knew that staying in America had been the right choice. His life was here now. His family was here. Colonel McCarthy stayed in touch. He visited the bakery once, years after the war, and Hans barely recognized him in civilian clothes. They shook hands, and the colonel met Anna, who was then a lively toddler. "You did well, Muller," the colonel said quietly. "You proved me right. You gave me a chance, sir. That is all I needed." The colonel smiled. "No, you gave yourself a chance. I just did not get in the way." The bakery thrived. Hans and Greta expanded it, hiring more staff, opening a second location. They became pillars of the community, known not as the German and his American wife, but as Hans and Greta, the couple who made the best bread in San Antonio and whose love story was whispered about with a mix of skepticism and admiration. They were proof that the world could heal, that enemies could become family, that love was not a weakness, but the strongest force in the world. And so the barbed wire that separated them became nothing more than a memory, a story to tell their grandchildren. The POW camp where they met was dismantled after the war, its barracks torn down, its fences removed. The land returned to Texas, absorbed back into the fields and towns as if the war had never touched it, but the love that grew there did not disappear. It endured. Hans and Greta lived into their 80s, side by side for more than 50 years. When Hans died in 1998, Greta was holding his hand. She told her daughter Anna that his last words were, "Thank you for saving me." Greta followed him 2 years later. They are buried together in San Antonio, under a headstone that reads, "Hans and Greta Muller, love knows no borders." Their story is not unique. There were other marriages like theirs, other prisoners who stayed, other women who chose love over fear. But each story is a miracle. Each story is proof that even in the darkest times, people can choose light. The wedding photograph still exists, kept by their descendants. In it, Hans stands in his prison uniform, Greta in her simple white dress, and behind them, blurred but visible, the barbed wire of Camp Swift. It is a photograph of contrasts, captivity and freedom, war and peace, enemy and beloved. It is a photograph that should not exist, and yet it does. Because love, as Hans and Greta proved, has no respect for war. It does not care about borders or flags or the categories we use to divide the world into us and them. Love sees only people, and when given the smallest chance, love will always, always find a way. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that hope is more powerful than hate, please subscribe to this channel. Hit that like button and share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Because the world needs more stories like Hans and Greta's, stories that remind us that we are all in the end just people trying to love and be loved. And that is the most powerful truth of all.